You have elites who are of European origin, who are encouraging this demonization of Israel. And then you have immigrants from Muslim lands who are watching Al Jazeera, but also getting signals from their own European elites. And together, that's a toxic mix.
Welcome to Oslo, Mr. Neuer. We would like to ask you a few questions about your work in UN Watch. Since Norway is a fervent believer in the UN, where we have positioned ourselves on the side of Germany, the EU, and confronting the Trump administration's policy, I would dare to say. Let me start by asking about the UNRWA, which Trump wants to dismantle. Is this a feasible policy?
It's a complicated issue. UNRWA was created in 1948, approximately, to deal with Palestinian refugees from the war of that year. And initially it had good intentions, but it was meant to resolve the problem, to settle them like the other UN agency. There are today 2 UN refugee agencies. There's one that's across the street from my office in Geneva called the UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, that deals with refugees around the world. And their goal is to go out of business, meaning their goal is to take refugees, resettle them, and the people are no longer refugees. My family were Jews in Poland and Russia. They fled pogroms, and they were received in Canada, and I'm no longer a Polish refugee because my grandparents left, in 1930. But so that's how the UN Refugee Agency works. They resettle refugees. So UNRWA, over time, became very different. UNRWA became a place where the refugee numbers don't go down, they go up. So instead of Palestinians who are Sunni Arabs who speak the same language as their neighbors, worship the same God, and instead of being resettled in Lebanon, Syria, etc., they were never resettled. And UNRWA over time became a political weapon by the Arab regimes who needed to justify their failures. And so they needed the war against Israel. And the UNRWA refugees was a visible example of Israel's sins in their eyes. So they, rather than try to solve the problem and to help the refugees, they sustained the wound and kept them in their suffering so that they would have a weapon against Israel, a political weapon. And sadly, to this day, UNRWA remains in that mode. It's a tool, it's become a political weapon against Israel, sadly using the plight of they're now the descendants of Palestinian refugees. There's very few remaining refugees from 1948. There's their children, their grandchildren, and the numbers grow and grow. And in Lebanon, we were told that there are 400,000 Palestinian refugees or more, according to the official UNRWA records. However, Lebanon itself did their own census, and it turns out that I think there's under 200,000. So that's double the amount. And UNRWA says yes, because when people leave, they don't tell us, so we keep them on. So the numbers are off, and there are core problems. In Jordan, there are about 2 million Palestinians who are called refugees, but they have the Jordanian passport. They're Jordanian citizens. Why are they refugees? I said in my case, my grandparents fled Poland in 1930. I'm not a Polish citizen, I'm a Canadian. And so there's no reason why someone who has citizenship in Jordan should be called a refugee. Even more so, someone in Gaza who's living in what the UN calls the state of Palestine. He's in historic British mandatory Palestine in Gaza or in the West Bank. Why is he a Palestinian refugee? There is a Palestinian Authority. They have a president. They have, according to the UN, it's a state of Palestine. Whatever you want to call it, the Palestinian Authority, they are in mandatory Palestine. Why are they refugees? Well, they're only refugees if it means going back to Israel. And going back to Israel means to eliminate Israel as we know it. Yeah. So it's, we speak about a 2-state process, but UNRWA effectively means a one state. It means a Palestinian state in the Palestinian areas, but then also the removal of Israel. So UNRWA is a very problematic agency, and I think it does need to change. Sadly, both the Arab countries, the Palestinians, and the Europeans, such as Norway, have not recognized this issue, and they seem to go along with this political weapon.
So the right of return is implicit in the status of Palestinians as...
UNRWA teaches them, it teaches Palestinians in Gaza, for example, that your home is not here, but your home is in Jaffa and in Haifa. And so we shouldn't be surprised that when the international community, countries like Norway, send tens of millions of dollars in aid into Gaza to build homes, hospitals, and schools, and they send cement in there, that when the Palestinians get the cement, when they've been educated in UNRWA schools, that their home isn't here. Their real home, is the right of return, is over there in Israel. So they take that cement and they build terror tunnels, kilometers and kilometers of terror tunnels that cost tens of millions of dollars because they're educated in UNRWA schools that their home is in Israel. And that has to stop. Just like Israel gave up settlements for peace, the Palestinians have to understand that, as the international community says, their home will be in West Bank and Gaza, but not in Israel.
Do you have any opinion on the two-state solution as part of Jared Kushner's peace plan that is...
We haven't seen it. But look, there already are effectively two states. The Palestinian entity, you could say three states because there's the West Bank and there's Gaza, but there's at least two entities, maybe three entities, and that's fine. I think the United Nations decided in 1947 there should be a Jewish sovereignty, there should be an Arab sovereignty in Palestine, a Jewish state and Arab state. And the Palestinians never accepted it. Even today, they don't seem to really want the state that they're offered. You know, when the Jews were offered a state, it was a fraction of what they thought they were going to get, of what they were promised under the League of Nations mandate in 1922. But they were happy to have sovereignty somewhere, and they accepted it. And the Palestinians don't seem to be content with the state. So in theory, it's what makes sense. The problem is, what does the Palestinian state look like? Will it be a state that's Hamas, terror state, that's trying to send rockets into Israel, attack planes arriving at Ben Gurion Airport? The question is, what kind of state? And for now, the example of Gaza is not an encouraging example. So there is some good cooperation with the Palestinian Authority, but we see that when Israel withdraws militarily from large areas, the radical Islamists enter, whether Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in the north, and it could even be worse. It could be ISIS. So that's the fear.
And if there were elections on the West Bank today, who would win?
We don't know. Abbas has now entered the 15th year of his 4-year term, which is quite extraordinary. And it means that Israel, in 6 months this year, will hold more elections than the PA has ever held in its entire lifetime. It's hard to know. It could well be Hamas because people want to reject corruption, but it's hard to know what would happen in a free election.
Trump wants to break the stasis that has developed over many decades.
Yeah, we haven't seen the plan. We've heard a lot of talk about it. There is movement by the Gulf Arab states. The Prime Minister Netanyahu was received in Oman by the leader there. An Israeli minister, Miri Regev, was in the Gulf. I think she was in the Emirates. Bahrain is offering to host this some kind of an economic improvement conference for the region. So there are clearly significant signs from many Gulf Arab states. Egypt, although the population remains hostile, the regime cooperates with Israel militarily in a very significant degree in the Sinai and otherwise. So there is a reconciliation of governments that we haven't seen ever before, even if it's not among the peoples and society. We don't want to exaggerate. But it seems that there is a willingness from the Gulf Arab states to move forward. And the question is whether the Palestinians will continue to do what Abba Eban famously said, is to never fail to miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
How do you read the Europeans' stance toward Israel at the moment? Because Germany, I believe, recognized BDS recently as an anti-Semitic organization.
Yes.
But on the other hand, the EU and Berlin has adapted to the Palestinian cause, trying to fill the gap after the Americans.
Yes, I would say that dating back to about 1975 approximately, when they began to embrace Arafat and the PLO as a viable partner, we've seen a one-sided approach from the European Union that does not factor in terrorism with the seriousness that it deserves. We see at the United Nations there are 20 resolutions every year against Israel. It's the topic of my lecture here this evening in Oslo. The European Union votes yes to 15 out of 20 anti-Israeli one-sided resolutions. So there's one resolution on Iran and there's 20 on Israel. Instead of the EU saying, no, this is ridiculous, as Australia did in the Human Rights Council, as Denmark did just now in March 2019 at the Human Rights Council, but at the General Assembly, EU votes for 15 out of 20 resolutions against Israel, and 5 of them they abstain. So this is not a very balanced approach. The European Union is not doing itself a favor, it's not doing the region a favor when they turn a blind eye to incitement to terrorism by Abbas, and whenever Israel is challenged by Hamas riots and violence, the European Union quickly condemns Israel for acting disproportionately. But I've seen here in Europe, I live in Switzerland, and I've seen that whenever there's a terrorist attack in Europe, and in France, the terrorism in the Bataclan in Paris, and hundreds of people arrested in Brussels, and the Europeans rightfully respond quickly and do whatever they can to secure their population, but they don't grant that same minimal right to Israel to protect its population from Hamas. And when Hamas mixes civilians with military using human shields, mixes civilians with terrorists, they ignore that. And so, unfortunately, the European Union, their policy only encourages more abuse of civilians, more incitement to terrorism. It's time to change their policy.
I have a feeling that Israelis are following European politics more closely than ever because of the huge Muslim population in Europe. Because they understand, or they anticipate, and they actually observe that their presence has begun to have an influence on European politics.
Yes, I'm not sure the precise effect. I mean, the problematic policies that I've seen in the European Union began long before the large Muslim influx. We're talking about elites, whether it's the BBC in England or academia in various European capitals, that were hostile to Israel out of certain kind of radical ideology, a red-green alliance. And yes, it's true that what we did see in Europe, I believe, some of the terrorism and the attacks in France, the anti-Semitism, is you have elites who are of European origin, who are encouraging this demonization of Israel, and then you have immigrants from Muslim lands who are watching Al Jazeera, but also getting signals from their own European elites. And together, that's a toxic mix. And then we see attacks on synagogues because you're killing innocent people in Israel, so we're going to attack your synagogue. So I wouldn't want to put all the blame or disproportionate blame on the Muslim population. I think some of the European, certainly on the left, the radical left, elites have been content on their own for some time to be hostile to Israel.
The anti-Semitic card has become a weapon of choice among European politicians. Recently, Angela Merkel gave an interview after the EU elections to Christian Amanpour. If you've heard about it, she said anti-Semitism is rearing its head in Germany again, and there is no kindergarten who hasn't experienced needs guard.
Armed guards standing in front
Right.
of soldiers, police. Yeah.
But she didn't mention, she left the impression that it was native Germans.
And not the 1 million Muslim immigrants that she brought in.
Because Steve Bannon said to Martha McCallum in Fox News that I was in Berlin for 4 days and Jewish representatives told me they were in fear of their lives for walking the streets. And you certainly heard about the Kippah warning.
Well, yes, of course. No, in Europe, I mean, I live in Geneva next to France. And there is a huge anti-Semitism among the Muslim population, and it's something that's taboo in Europe. The elites did not want to speak about it, and it was clear that when Angela Merkel brought in 1 million from the Middle East, they could be very good people, but if you're brought up in Syria, you're brought up on a virulent anti-Semitism of the worst kind. That's in the schools, that's in the mosques, it's all around you. And if and at least acknowledge it, at least say, well, we need to educate people, and we know that they're coming with a virus, a very significant virus of hatred, which existed in Europe too. This is Europe where, the Holocaust happened because of the Nazis, and many European countries have collaborated with them. Let's not give Europe a free pass here. But today, Europe, at least as a society, is does not have state-sanctioned anti-Semitism, whereas in the Middle East, it's the daily bread, and it's in all the schools, and it's in the Syrian defense minister used to, he published a book called The Matzah of Zion about the blood libel. So this is what people have been brought up on, and if you bring these people from there, and you don't say, okay, we're bringing them because we're humanitarian, but at least acknowledge it. If you don't even acknowledge it, that shows to me a blindness. So it's not surprising to me that people don't want to acknowledge it.
On the 9th of January in 2009, there was a huge demonstration in front of the parliament, and it evolved into some call it a pogrom, where the demonstrators were chasing, calling for Jews. I mean, you've seen the same in other countries. What do you think will be the situation if you have another war against Gaza?
You're mentioning the time of 2009. We had in 2014 in Europe, in Paris, attacks on synagogues. So, generally those who are violent tend to be the Muslim immigrants. But again, they are getting signals from the establishment. And when they see that the government is pointing the finger at Israel time and time again, when they are faced with the most cynical of Hamas attacks, where they deliberately attack Israel from civilian areas, attacking civilians, wanting Israel to attack civilians, knowing that much of the world will take an effects-based approach, that if people are killed, then Israel must be guilty, rather than actually understand who the target was and what Hamas was doing and so forth. So sadly, yes, there's a fear that will happen again. That is a real fear, and I think it's incumbent upon the European establishment, the foreign ministry, academics, media, to stop this turning a blind eye to Hamas terrorism and have this knee-jerk blaming of Israel, because the effects are to encourage exactly those kinds of violent attacks on Jews in Europe. They come together, and we can't pretend that they're not. If you demonize the Jewish state, then you are effectively inciting people to violence. We see it happening.
And there is perception, propaganda in the press that delegitimize the right-wing government of Israel.
Certainly the right is easier to delegitimize, but we recall when there was Olmert, who was trying to give back basically everything to Abbas, and Abbas said no, and there was an equal amount of delegitimization. It's easier when it's a right wing for them, but over time it's something that certainly at the UN, whether it's left or right, in the end it's the same. But certainly it's easier when it's a right wing, even though Netanyahu, for being such a right wing guy, probably fought the least amount of wars, killed the least amount of Palestinians than anyone else. But it's easy to demonize.
Israelis look at Europe and say, you don't know what's in store for you. We know. This is something Israelis tell us.
I don't comment on the European situation in particular, but clearly we've had terrorism in Europe in the past 10 years, very significant. Again in France, a very significant amount of terrorism from ISIS and others, and it's something the Europeans have to understand.
Hillel Neuer, thank you for coming.
Thank you.